Write it down. So we accept recording. So we are so grateful to see us together here in this room. I'm going to share the dramatic toy that I have that is going to block the sun. The people in the room, maybe later. Welcome to folks who are coming into the room. Welcome to all of the folks who are joining us online. My name is Rabbi Adam Scott Stoker, one of the rabbis here at Mount Zion. On behalf of the congregation, welcome to all our congregants, to our wider community as well. I have been saying Psalm 130 for over a year as a ritual to remember the hostages that have been held by Hamas day after day. As I've lived my life, and then just yesterday, the emotion to see the videos of Karina, Ariev, Daniela Gaboa, Alma Levi, Larry Alba, their reunion with their families after 477 days in captivity. Our tradition says that if you have not seen a friend in a year, that you recite, "Praise be God who resurrects the dead," the B'fayei HaMetim. That prayer never felt more real. And my prayers have been with all Israelis during this war, especially those who mourn loved ones from the day of terror on October 7th, and as well with all Gazans who have suffered beyond description, beyond. And those in Lebanon, and now especially those in the West Bank. I have thought about this morning's program for over 2 years. Last year, we delayed this program for a year. I've imagined what I would say to frame a program about anti-Semitism that was a chance for our community not to be reactive, but rather reflective. When we are in stress, it is hard to listen. We are, of course, still stressed, but maybe less like our ancestors in last week's Parsha, the beginning of Exodus, who could not listen to Moses because of their kotzer ruach, their shortness of breath from their enslavement. God told Moses to keep talking, and I know that it will be, and he knew that God knew rather, that it will be heard at the right time. I pray that this morning is the right time. And I know I don't have to frame anything more this morning about anti-Semitism because we have the right people on our panel and the moderator who will do just that. But one comment, given that scholars cannot agree on a definition of anti-Semitism, we should take a moment to name the reality we face, that there are Jewish groups whose role is to call out anti-Semitism, to name certain actions or statements as anti-Semitic, knowing that other Jewish groups may disagree. And now we understand why we are here this week. So, a little less heavy, few practicalities. For those of us here in person, our bathrooms are down the hall, over there. And we have behind me down the hall a single-use all-gender bathroom. All our plates and utensils are compostable, so please use the green compost bins, but if you have other trash, we have trash cans in the kitchen. We have about 200 people here in the room and over 300 on Zoom, including our panelists. I want to thank JCRC for partnering with Mount Zion on this program, especially to my friend Steve Honix, Executive Director, and to Lorraine Fishman, and especially Sammy Rafamim, who has done so much to make today a reality. And at Mount Zion, Gabby Health, Teresa Matzik, Karen Balto, and our Executive Director, Kate Tucker. I'd like to ask all of our co-sponsors who are in the room to please stand for us, as we can give you appreciation. We are so grateful. We're grateful to St. Paul Federation, Beth Jacob, Temple of Aaron, Jewish Community Action, Hineni, and the Anti-Defamation League, ADL of the Nexus. So friends, the goal of today is to slow the conversation down and to open the conversation. As you listen, please be curious. When you hear a word that triggers a reaction, take that deeper breath and wonder what is behind your emotional reaction. Most importantly, try not to listen in order to confirm what you already feel or know. Try to stretch yourself. What might be an aha that you didn't expect? Today is not a day for our echo chambers. Thank God. Let's learn and widen our tent because we're all in it together and we need each other. Our distinguished panel will be moderated by Ben Sales, originally from Chicago. He is the news editor for a Jewish telegraphic agency covering anti-Semitism as well as American Jewish affairs. Previously, he was JPA's Israel correspondent living in Tel Aviv. He has reported from 10 different countries, former editor of New Voices magazine. His academic background in journalism comes from Columbia University. His undergraduate work from WashU in St. Louis. And our distinguished panelists in alphabetical order. Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of TRUWA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. In their words, an organization that trains and mobilizes more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors and their communities to bring a moral voice to protecting and advancing human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. She is the author of 2 books, one of which is There Shall Be No Needy, Pursuing Social Justice Through Jewish Law and Tradition. Rabbi Jacobs has been named 3 times to the Forward's list of 50 most influential American Jews, to Newsweek's list of 50 most influential rabbis in America, and to the Jerusalem Post 2013 list of women to watch. He holds a rabbinic ordination and an MA in Talmud from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where she was a Webster Fellow, an MS in Urban Affairs from Hunter College, and a BA from Columbia University. Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College and Chair of the Jewish Studies Program, faculty member of the Religion Department. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish and Protestant thought during the 19th and 20th centuries, including the history of biblical scholarship, Jewish scholarship on Islam, and the history of anti-Semitism. She's received many honors, including the Mendelsohn Prize of the Leo Baeck Institute, 5 honorary degrees from universities in the US, Canada, Switzerland, and Germany. Currently, she is a Guggenheim Fellow and writing a book on the history of European Jewish scholarship on Islam. Her undergraduate work was at Trinity College, her Master's of Theological Studies at Harvard Divinity School, her PhD at University of Pennsylvania. And on a brief personal notes, Dr. Heschel agreed to speak in my undergraduate dorm at a class that a friend and I organized in 1989 on Jewish-Christian relations. It's so meaningful to once again welcome her. And I learned that she spent part of 3rd grade here in St. Paul. She went to Horace Mann, when her dad, Rabbi Abraham Jeffrey Heschel, taught at the University of Minsk. Alyza D. Lewin is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, a nonprofit organization established to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. As a lawyer, she specializes in litigation, mediation, and government relations. She led the litigation team that represented Avi Zinger, the Israeli licensee of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, in the lawsuit that Mr. Zinger filed against Unilever to prevent Ben & Jerry's boycott of Israel. In 2014, she argued a case before the US Supreme Court, a case involving the constitutionality of a law granting any American citizen born in Jerusalem the right to list Israel as the place of birth on his or her US passport. That paved the way for President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. She began her career working in Israel, where she clerked on the Supreme Court for Deputy President Justice Nachum Elon. Her BA is from Princeton University, her JD from New York University School of Law. And to our distinguished panelists, I left all the personal information and any kind of other interesting things out, so you're welcome to add that in as you wish. We will have this panel discussion until around 11 a.m., a little after Central Time, then have time for Q&A. In-person index cards are on our food tables, which you're welcome to pick up and write a question, and we'll collect them. And Sammy Rockman will be collecting those on Zoom. You can use the function that is available to you. Sammy, is it Q&A or is it chat? Q&A function. Lastly, we are reflecting on 3 definitions of anti-Semitism. We have copies in the room on the food table to share, and Sammy's going to put the links in the chat. Then I turn this over now. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate in particular the being on Central Time. As somebody who was born and raised in Chicagoland, it is nice to hear Central Time as opposed to the tyranny of Eastern Time, which I think we have all succumbed to in general. So thank you all for being here in person and on Zoom. Thank you to my very distinguished panelists who I'm really happy to be in this virtual room with. As we all know, the past 7 days have been a very big week in the news, both in Israel, here in the United States. There are things happening right now, in fact, in terms of the recently agreed upon hostage and ceasefire deal. All that is to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to take a step back right now and have this discussion about a topic that I think has been on everyone's mind for a long time, which is anti-Semitism and how to define it and how those definitions operate. So thank you again. I'm going to start out, and I'm just going to go around the way I see the panelists on my panel and on my screen, and then we'll kind of loop back. But we have about 45 minutes. I'll try to keep my questions brief, and we have a lot of ground to cover. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to start out by asking each of you, and I'll start with you, Alyza. What is the value in your mind of creating these definitions, or a specific definition that you would like to speak to? And in terms of that definition or any of them, what do they add to the conversation? What do they differentiate from the other ones?
So thank you. I want to thank the hosts who put this together. It's a terrific panel. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thank you, Ben. So I think defining anti-Semitism is crucial if we're going to effectively combat it. We have to all be able to get on the same page to recognize and identify what is anti-Semitism today and how anti-Semitism manifests in today's society. Because if we can't recognize it, if we can't see it, then we can't effectively address it. I do support the use of the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. I think it's unique, and I think it's the most comprehensive definition that we have today. The IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, was actually established all the way back in 2000. The IHRA definition, which I know we've put in the links, wasn't actually issued, their definition of anti-Semitism, until 2016. First, they issued a definition on Holocaust denial and distortion, and then several years later issued this one on anti-Semitism. But what makes the IHRA unique is that, as opposed to whereas throughout history, we've often had scholars, either individually or as a group, that have tried to come up with definitions of anti-Semitism, the IHRA is an intergovernmental body. So it's a body that includes political representatives from countries around the world, as well as scholars who worked over these many years to come up with this definition, because they realized that they needed to come up with what they called a common approach to the upsurge in anti-Semitism, on Holocaust denial and trivialization. And the other thing that's unique is that this body didn't work by majority rules, they ruled by consensus. So when they issued their working definition in 2016, there were 31 countries that were members of the IHRA, and they had to all agree unanimously on the language of this definition. Since then, there have been another 4 countries that have joined as members, another 8 as observer countries. So all of those countries, all the 35 member countries now, all have adopted this definition. The definition itself has actually been adopted more widely than any other definition. You now have, according to the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, over 1,200 entities that have adopted it, which include 45 countries, 37 state governments and 96 county and county governments in the US. It includes the European Commission, the European Union, which published a handbook about how it could be used, the Organization of American States, and the Global Imam Council. So it's the most universally recognized, both, as I say, by politicians and political entities, as well as by scholars. And what's important about understanding how it works and how it's set up is that when the IHRA went to work on this, they decided to utilize what had then been issued. There was a working definition that had been issued by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia. And this working definition was actually adopted in 2010 by the US State Department. So 2010, during the Obama administration, was the first time that the United States actually recognized and adopted a definition of anti-Semitism. And I think we'll be able to put the State Department 2010 definition link in the Zoom chat for the people who are there. But what you'll see, and I urge everyone to actually read the IHRA definition and this 2010 definition side by side, because they are almost identical. So first of all, both definitions, IHRA and 2010, start with a definition of anti-Semitism. This is the 2010 one that I'm holding up here, but they both start with a definition. You'll see the definition language is word for word identical. And then they have a list of examples that you can use to understand that definition. The language of the examples is also almost identical between both, with some minor changes, but the major, most significant difference is that the 2010 definition pulled out the examples relative to Israel, put them on the second page under a heading that says, what is anti-Semitism relative to Israel? And I think that's the question that we still, mind you, this was 2010, are still trying to answer today. When does the criticism of Israel cross the line into anti-Semitism? Because this definition in 2010 and the IHRA definition were not intended to silence criticism of Israel. In fact, at the very bottom of the 2010 definition, under all the examples and under the Israel examples, it says, however, criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. And what's interesting is that in the IHRA definition, they took that exact same sentence, and instead of putting it at the end below all the examples, they moved it up to the top above all the examples to emphasize and highlight that this is not about silencing criticism of Israel. It's about trying to understand when that criticism of Israel crosses the line and is not a legitimate political debate about policies. But what it really is, it's the vilification and dehumanizing of Jews. And that's what I think we need the definition for. We need it today more than ever. We need these definitions because people are having a very hard time trying to understand on campuses and beyond campus what is actually a good faith political debate about Israel's policies in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and what really is the vilification and dehumanizing and shunning and marginalizing of Jews. And so we can then get back into the details of the definition, maybe in another question, but that's the background for IHRA.
Thank you, Alyza. Jill, I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you believe the value is in having these definitions? And if there's a definition you want to speak to, I know you're kind of associated with two of them here. You know, how do they differentiate? How are they different from the other ones that are on the table? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thank you to Rabbi Spilker and everybody in Minneapolis for hosting us. So first of all, I want to say that this conversation does feel very live, given that we're in a moment or maybe several years of rising anti-Semitism. This past year, there's been, of course, so much attention to what's been happening on the college campus, which I know we'll talk about more. But I'm also really thinking a lot about the pardon this week of the January 6th. Those who were convicted on January 6th of invading the Capitol and various crimes that are associated, and really remembering the last Trump administration when we saw white nationalists, many of whom were armed, emboldened, and unfortunately carrying out murders at synagogues and other violence. And so I'm really thinking a lot about the possibility that we're going to, I mean, I hope this will not happen, but about the possibility that we're going to return to that period where there's emboldened white nationalists who we know have committed most of the violent anti-Semitic crimes of the last many years. So I'll say that. to say this is a very live conversation. Okay, so why do we do definitions? Well, definitions are helpful in general, but particularly around anti-Semitism because it is so poorly understood, especially among non-Jews, but even honestly, Jews are confused. I've had so many conversations with people really across the spectrum over the last number of years, often who don't actually know really the first thing about anti-Semitism or Jews. I'll say that one conversation that really resonates that I think about a lot was that right after Charlottesville, I was talking to a non-Jewish reporter from a secular publication. And she said to me, I just don't understand how this could have happened because the Holocaust was so long ago. And I realized in that moment that in her mind, the Holocaust was kind of an event that just came out of nowhere, like the Nazis landed from outer space, invented anti-Semitism, carried out the Holocaust, and then went back to outer space, which for all of us who know anything about the history of anti-Semitism is not really how it went, right? The Nazis had to have something to go on. But I realized that perhaps because in this country we've done often a very good job, maybe not a good enough job, but often a decent job of doing Holocaust education, but often it's in a vacuum. And so there is a need for definitions of anti-Semitism, and particularly historically rooted definitions. And I want to say that those definitions, I believe, should not be legislated. There's not a legislated definition of racism or sexism or homophobia or any other ism or phobia, and in part because it's so contextual, right? So if I tell a Jewish joke to my husband, for example, that's not anti-Semitism, that's two Jews talking. If a non-Jew is telling a Jewish joke, really probably in any context, could be the same joke, right? That's likely anti-Semitism, or certainly if it's used as a mode of harassment. And so the context is really important. And when there's investigations, I can't speak to this administration, but certainly in the last one, when Department of Education would do an investigation, they're looking at the context, not just of anti-Semitism, but of racism or anything else that they're investigating. They're really looking at the context, not just the particular specific incident. And so I want to say that I don't believe that definitions, IHRA, or any other definition, including the Jerusalem Declaration or Nexus, should be legislated. They are helpful in terms of having conversations and in terms of education. So some background on the Jerusalem Declaration. This really, I think the first time that I heard about it or was invited to a conversation about it was in the winter of 2019 from Alon Confino, Zichrono Livracha. He was a professor at University of Massachusetts who just passed away a few months ago, and who reached out because he was originally gathering a group for a in-person conference that was going to happen in May 2020. That obviously did not happen, but was pulling together scholars and others to think about a new definition of anti-Semitism that would respond to some of the weaknesses of the IHRA definition. So as Alyza talked about a little bit, IHRA really came out of an effort specifically in Europe to be able to classify what was and wasn't anti-Semitism, often in relationship to Israel, but it was not ever meant to be legislated. And the actual definition is just a few lines long of IHRA, and it's pretty vague, right? It talks about a certain, I think the word is perception of Jews, right? But it doesn't really spell out the stereotypes that are often used about Jews. That's one issue with it. And the other issue is that the examples, most of the discussion about IHRA is not actually about the definition, it's about the examples. And there is in the examples an overfocus on Israel. So I think 7 out of 11 of the the examples focus on Israel. And there's a couple in particular that I think we'll get into more, but that have been misused in some cases to shut down free speech and criticism of Israel that one may or may not agree with, but you can have criticism of the United States or Canada or any other country that one may or may not agree with, but it's criticism of a country. So there's at least a couple of the examples that have been used to cut down on free speech about Israel. We've seen that particularly over the last year plus. And so the Jerusalem Declaration, I think you all have it in front of you, so I'm not going to go through it, but it attempts to really break down specifically where criticism of Israel or where it does cross over into anti-Semitism and where it's criticism like you would have for any other country. So it's an attempt to be much more specific than IHRA is, and also broader. So there are specific examples about Israel, but also a broader context that anti-Semitism is much more than where it plays out on Israel. And again, it's not meant to be legislated, and that's also true of Nexus. I want to say that I was asked to speak about the Jerusalem Declaration. I'm also, which I signed, I'm also on the advisory board for Nexus. The two definitions they're different in their particulars, but they're aiming at the same idea, and I'd say generally agree with one another.
Thank you, Jill. Suzanne, I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you see as the value in defining anti-Semitism, having these written definitions, and as somebody who's kind of viewed all three of them as all of us have, how do you see the differentiation between the three of them?
Thank you. So let me say, first of all, that there's been an outbreak of anti-Semitism, like something we never thought would happen. So I will say, on the one hand, there's something very positive I like about each of the definitions, and something that I don't like. So it's a typical academic, I suppose. But let me also say that in this moment, with really rising anti-Semitism all over the world, from Vietnam to the Middle East to Asia, China, and so on, I'm not sure what we really need to be doing is coming up about definitions and labeling. I mean, every day I get emails saying, this is anti-Semitic, that's anti-Semitic. Fine, I know that. I want to know what to do about it. What do I do about it? And I don't feel I'm getting much advice, given how many people, scholars who write about anti-Semitism, Jewish organizations that write about it. I mean, ADL is very well funded and has a research center. I don't need a label. I don't need a report card about a university. I need to know how to overcome the anti-Semitism, even on the most practical level. As a professor with colleagues, as a professor with students, what do I do? What do I say? After October 7th, I organized 2 faculty forums at Dartmouth. We had 4 professors sitting with the students to demonstrate to them how we speak to one another with dignity, with respect, with calm, with empathy. We need to talk, and there's a special way to talk to one another in a university context. I don't feel that these definitions help me. So in that sense, I'm not satisfied with them. I don't know the legal system as Alyza does, obviously. I don't know about the implementation. I don't know about how they will work, how they function. I also worry about how anti-Semitism functions. For example, it's one thing for me to sit down calmly with a colleague who makes some comments about Israel, about Zionism, or a student may come in, and I encourage my students to come and talk to me. Let's discuss it. You have criticisms, let's talk about it. What's your evidence? What's counter evidence? Let's think it through. And I want to know how we can create persuasion for people who are saying things that they may not even realize in the moment are anti-Semitic. But I also want us to pay attention to how things are said. It's one thing to calmly talk with a student who's 18, who doesn't know anything really much, and who has picked up some language, some verbiage, and okay, we have a conversation. It's very different when I have students or colleagues, or simply the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Charlottesville, with torches of lit on fire, screaming anti-Semitic slogans. That's very different. And these definitions need to be attentive to that, because I think that's a big distinction. The tone of voice, who says it, if it's said once, if it's constant, the context, etc. And then, one last thing is from the practical level. What do I do? Let's say here I am as a professor. I review a syllabus that's being proposed by a new adjunct person who's coming to teach a class. And I look through and I read the readings that are going to be assigned, and I see an article that I think is anti-Semitic. And I say, this cannot be taught. And my colleagues, my deans, and so on say, you're right, it's going to be eliminated from the syllabus. Okay, but what does that tell me about the person who's been hired and what might be said in the classroom? even without the article, will the ideas nonetheless be conveyed? What do I do about that? Are we going to have monitors in classrooms? I'm suspicious of a person who would assign such an article, but is that the basis for firing someone? Maybe the article was assigned in order to criticize it, for example. In my Jewish history classes, we'll read an anti-Semitic text from the 19th century, let's say, to criticize it, not to advocate. So I'm just thinking about the implementation at colleges, for instance. How do we do it? And where's the guidance? Who's advising us? I don't need the labels. I need the advice. Thank you.
I appreciate you bringing it up. I think that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is how do these definitions relate to the lived experiences of American Jews, and can they help American Jews deal with those lived experiences and incidents of anti-Semitism? Can they help them cope with them and address them? John, I'm going to turn back to you for that. How do you think these definitions can help rank and file American Jews deal with, from what we've seen, a torrent of rising anti-Semitism?
Thanks. Yeah, and thank you, Susannah, for bringing the voice from the campus. I am talking often with also academics, but very often with rabbis who are on campus, which is an extremely hard position to be in. The rabbis are really trying to support all of their students, some of whom have been out at the protests, and some of whom are scared of the protests, and some of whom just want to go to class and not do anything political, and that's also fine. And really, there's been a lot of confusion about when what's happening on campus or elsewhere is anti-Semitism, and when it's criticism of Israel that people may or may not agree with. And it's really important, I think, particularly because so I'll speak from two different angles. So one, it's important to be able to say when this criticism does actually cross the line into anti-Semitism, which it often does. I have a couple of articles, an old one and then a new one that I wrote this year that goes through a number of areas in which I think that I think criticism of Israel does carry over into anti-Semitism. So for example, disregard for the lives of Jews or for Israelis, justification of violence against Jews or Israelis, believing that all Jews need to speak for Israel, so that Jews can't do anything on campus without disavowing Israel or their connection to Israel, using classic tropes like greed and just sort of classic conspiracy theories, believing that Israel or Zionism has outsized influence. So when you're applying kind of these classical conspiracy theories about greed and like desire for blood, right? That conspiracies about Israel selling Palestinian organs, which it does not do, right, etc. Those are places where it does cross over into anti-Semitism. Places where it doesn't cross over into anti-Semitism are places where you're criticizing Israel on its human rights record, where you're criticizing Israel the way that you would criticize any other state. And that, again, you can believe in it or not believe it, right? Free speech includes speech that one doesn't agree with, right? Very famously, Justice Brandeis talked about how the response to speech that one might not agree with, or even disinformation, is more speech, not enforced silence. And so places where there's criticism of Israel's conduct in certainly this war or any war, criticism of the way that Israel was established, the same way that you can have conversations about the establishment of the United States and the impact on Native Americans, for example, or slavery from the United States through, certainly through its impact on racism today, right? Those are conversations and criticisms you can have about any country, and it's not anti-Semitism. Boycotting Israel, the way that one might boycott any other country. We're all boycotting Russia right now. We're all boycotting Syria. If I decide to boycott Canada tomorrow, people might look at me funny, but it's completely a reasonable thing to do. Right, that's also a protected First Amendment right. And so it's really important to have definitions, I would say particularly Jerusalem Declaration and Nexus, which are very specific in where it's anti-Semitism and where it is not anti-Semitism, whether you agree with the criticism or not. both to give guidance for Jews who reasonably are scared and confused and often wish that all of the protests and all of the criticism about Israel would go away, and also to help Jews understand, okay, here's the places where it's actually crossing over into anti-Semitism. Here's the places where you might be uncomfortable and you might seriously disagree, but it's not actually anti-Semitism. And also to help people who are maybe trying to protest Israel understand these are the parameters, right? These are the places where you can protest and be really angry about Israel and what it's done in Gaza during this war or about the occupation. And there is actually a lot of legitimate free speech in there. And here's the places where it crosses over into hate speech. Now, hate speech is also, for the most part, in the United States, protected speech, but it is, speech that one might educate, especially on campus, for people to avoid, just like you would educate people to avoid racist or homophobic or sexist hate speech on campus, even if it's technically legal. So I do think that these definitions are helpful in helping to cut through maybe some of the really strong emotions and help us to have a real conversation about what is legitimate criticism, even if we think it's wrong, even if one thinks it's wrong or misguided, but what is in that realm and when does it cross over, also to ensure that the free speech of people who are protesting is protected, which unfortunately we've seen a lot of restrictions on basic free speech, both before October 7th, generally in the United States, especially through legislation trying to ban in different ways boycotts of Israel, as well as particularly in the last year, attempts to shut down even legitimate protest on campus.
Thank you. Alyza, I want to turn to you, both to address the same question, how do these definitions, how does the IHRA definition help American Jews deal with everyday anti-Semitism they've been experiencing, but also, I think, to address more head-on the question that a few people have raised here, that you articulated: when does criticism of Israel cross the line into anti-Semitism, and how does the IHRA definition, the IHRA definition, address that, and yeah, to speak to those issues. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let's start with, I think that one of the challenges that we have today is that society really doesn't understand Jewish identity. Okay, put aside they don't understand anti-Semitism, and we'll come to that, and that's one of the reasons why the IHRA definition is important. But let's just start with the fact that they don't understand Jewish identity. For many years, right, and on campuses, I mean, as president of the Brandeis Center, I speak almost every single day to students on campus. Now, after October 7th, it's not just students, it's faculty, it's staff. And I speak increasingly to people who are off campuses, who are employees or others who are experiencing anti-Semitism. But when you talk to the students, let's say on the campus, and this has been going on for years, universities have had a tendency to pigeonhole Jews. They think of Jews as just a faith, as just a religion, right? They think, what do our Jewish students need? Maybe they need kosher food, maybe they need a Yom Kippur accommodation. But the notion that there are Jews who may not be religiously observant, but may still define themselves as part of the Jewish people, right? They don't think about that. And what does it mean to be part of the Jewish people when you have, these Pew studies that talk even about Jews of no religion? What does it mean to still define yourself as part of the Jewish people when you say, I don't observe the Sabbath or I don't keep a kosher diet, but I'm still part of the Jewish people? What that is saying is that there's a history, there's a heritage of the Jewish people that I view as the history and heritage of my people, right? So if I mark the Passover Seder, it's because I believe that my ancestors were liberated from slavery in Egypt. I mark Hanukkah because I believe my ancestors were those Maccabees that fought for freedom, right? And so the truth is, it's impossible to separate the history and heritage of our people from the land of Israel. The land of Israel is where the identity of the Jewish people as a people was cemented and forged. We lived there as a people with a king, with a common code of law system, with a court system, with a temple, right? That's where we lived as a people. And the truth is, what is happening today is there is a very concerted effort to erase and deny that the Jews have that history and heritage connected to the land of Israel. So if you say, for example, I define my identity not by religious practice. That's not the way if somebody says that's not the way it's not about religious belief or religious practice for me. But what it is that I define my identity as part of a people indigenous to the land of Israel. It may be that a person may say that, and they may be highly critical of the policies of the current government of Israel. But if they say, I define my identity as part of a people indigenous to the land of Israel, that means they're a Zionist. And today on campus, if you're a Zionist, that means you should be treated as a pariah because you're evil. Nobody asks you what your opinion is about two states or what your opinion is about specific policies. You're just automatically labeled as a pariah, treated as evil. In fact, for years, even before October 7th, it's been referred to as the placard strategy to try to boil this down almost to a very simple equation on the campuses. The rhetoric was designed to say that Star of David, that Jew is a Zionist, is whatever the evil concept is. It could be apartheid, it could be colonialism, now it's a genocide, right? It wasn't put out there because people wanted to have a conversation about, does this meet the legal definition of apartheid? No, the idea for each of these was to just hammer into people's heads that Star of David, that Jew is the Zionist, is evil. Just get that, accept that. Because if you think about how anti-Semitism has worked through the centuries, right? Anti-Semitism is called our oldest hatred. It may be society's oldest hatred, but it's actually one of the most difficult to recognize. And that's because it looks a little different in every generation. It doesn't look the same, it morphs. But there's one constant about anti-Semitism, no matter what the century, no matter what the era, and that is that it will take whatever that society, whatever that generation views as its evil, as its misfortune, and it scapegoats the Jew. The Jew is to blame, because it's much easier to blame the Jew than to really try to dig down deep and figure out what is really the cause of what's ailing society. And so the Jew becomes the scapegoat. And then the natural consequence is, well, if the Jew is to blame, society would be better off without the Jews. So let's push the Jews out. I mean, if you think about it, think about the Yellow Star of David, for example, that the Nazis had the Jews wear. The idea was that if you saw somebody wearing that yellow star, you didn't engage with them. You didn't use them as your doctors or your lawyers or shop in their stores. Maybe you spat at them, right? You shunned them, you pushed them out. And that was the first step to completely dehumanizing the Jews. And then we see where it can escalate. And in fact, the ADL has what they call this pyramid of hate. And you can Google it and you can find it. And what the ADL's pyramid of hate basically says is that hate starts with biased attitudes, right? And if you don't address the biased attitudes, then it escalates, right? Then you start to have the jokes, the slurs, right? And then it'll escalate to actual shunning and to actual discrimination and exclusion. And then it will go up, if you still haven't addressed it, to acts of violence. Then you'll see the vandalism and the assaults, and all the way at the top is genocide, right? And so if you think about how anti-Semitism has worked, right, it is throughout the centuries said the Jews are to blame. So whether it was that the Jews were accused of killing Christ, whether the Jews were accused, and it doesn't matter what's your perspective, right? Whatever you think is the evil is the Jew. So Jews could be accused of being the capitalists, they could be accused of being the communists. You could have absolutely, 180-degree conflicting theories, because at the bottom level, it's a conspiracy theory, just blaming the Jew for what you don't like. And so if you think about it, right, the Nazis, they sought a pure Aryan race. They didn't view the Jews as white. They viewed the Jews as the ultimate race polluters. But today, there are those who, when they divide the world into the oppressed and the oppressors, they suddenly say all Jews are white. Doesn't matter where they come from, doesn't matter their background, doesn't matter their skin color. All Jews are categorized as white colonizing oppressors. Why? Because that's today's evil. That's today's evil. And so if you think about that and you realize that this is the way society anti-Semitism has worked through the generations, then you realize that today, one of the things that's different is we don't just have individual Jews scattered around the globe. We now actually have a Jewish collective. We have the Jewish nation state of Israel. And so what we see is that today, when people are talking about what's viewed as our greatest evils, right? Apartheid, colonialism, racism, genocide, right? Suddenly they say, well, which country in the world is the world's worst offender when it comes to human rights violations? They don't say it's Iran or North Korea or Russia with Ukraine or China with Uyghurs. No, none of those. It's the Jewish state that's the world's worst offender, right? The democracy, the one democracy there in that region of the world where all ethnicities and all faiths and all genders are all equal under the law, that's the country that they say is the world's worst offender when it comes to human rights violations. And then what do they say? The answer is Israel shouldn't exist, right? Erwin Cutler, who is this international human rights attorney, renowned. He's the former and was the first Canadian special envoy to combat anti-Semitism. He put it beautifully. He said that if traditional anti-Semitism sought to deny individual Jews their place in society, today's form of anti-Semitism seeks to do the same to the Jewish collective, to the Jewish nation state of Israel. It seeks to deny its place in the society of nations. There's no other country in the world that's told it has no right to exist. So now you want to know about how you know when the anti-Semitism crosses the line. So
Alyza, I appreciate that. I'm just really mindful of the clock.
okay, go ahead, and we'll come back, and I'll tell you these three, the Natan
we can come
Sharansky's
back.
3
So
deeds.
thank you. I don't mean to interrupt, but I know that we have only a few minutes until we're going to get to the Q&A portion, and some people have already submitted some great questions that we're going to get to. But before we do that, Susannah, I want to turn to you with another question that we were going to discuss, which is, and you spoke about this a little bit, you're there on the ground on campus. How has your thinking about all these questions, about definitions, about crossing the line, when does criticism of Israel become anti-Semitism, all of these things, how has your perspective on all of this changed since October 7th?
So, and I appreciate your passion, Alyza, and I agree with almost everything you've said, and Jill as well. I would just want to say, would take it a step further, and since October 7th, but even before, but what's become clear is, first of all, that as Shulamit Volkov wrote, the great historian from Tel Aviv University, anti-Semitism can become a cultural code. It becomes, I think, today, a personal form of identification, whether you draw from certain political theory or whatever it is. And in that way, people identify themselves as saying, they'll get up and say, I am pro-BDS, or I'm for Palestinians, and so on. They identify themselves. That I find to be extremely dangerous. It's not just what is said, but this is the form of identification. And that is what we need to worry about and to address. Since October 7th, I see actually anti-Semitism destroying certain fields, certain ways of thinking, certain intellectual movements. When the two leading feminist theorists of our day, Judith Butler and Nancy Fraser, said it wasn't rape October 7th, it was resistance, that's the end of feminism. Certainly the end of their work as feminist theorists, because the bottom line is, you believe the women, and it doesn't matter how short her skirt is or what her political viewpoint or what citizenship she holds, rape is rape. So anti-Semitism is also functioning to undermine what people stand for, their whole body of scholarship and work, and that's destructive in a terrible way. I also worry, we're really at this point, issue isn't Zionism, the issue is the state of Israel. And for people to say Israel has no right to exist, we've been hearing that from the UN for so many decades, my whole life. So of course, the rhetoric that's repeated over and over, this is definitely the problem. And my question would also be, why haven't we intervened more strongly? I mean, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that's one issue. But another is, to what extent do these definitions also create tensions within the Jewish community? And that worries me. There are parents who are in conflict with their children over Israeli policies, over the government, that sometimes can become a question, a debate over Israel's right to exist. Yes, but often it's just a question of, do I support the policies of this current government? Do I support one state, two states? Or people who will say, if you support a Palestinian state, you're endangering the state of Israel. You're threatening its viability by creating a Palestinian state. That worries me. Can we, as Jews, with one another internally, can we have certain discussions and not have to worry or not have to point the finger or not exclude people from the community? I don't want to see these definitions functioning as either propaganda for the current Israeli government and policies, or as a way that tears us apart as Jews. And maybe what we need is a stronger voice that is not the negative voice that which we need against anti-Semitism, yes, but a positive voice about what it is to be a Jew.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. I'm actually gonna turn to some of our audience questions because we have a little less than a half hour before we have to start wrapping up. So there are a couple questions that have kind of recurred here in the chat, and I think the first one is concretely, and Susannah, I want to come back to you on this a little bit, but Jill, I'm going to turn to you for this first. Is you know, you talked about the answer to speech being more speech, and how you're wary of efforts to shut down speech. How do you think campuses should respond to what be it anti-Israel or anti-Zionist protests, and especially in cases where that appears to cross the line into anti-Semitism? And do you believe that these definitions have a role in that?
Thanks so much. So I'll say again, I'm not on campus as Susannah is, and but I do talk to a lot of people on campus and understand how very challenging it is, including talking to administrators over the last year. So I think that I think that campuses should be educational environments. And we shouldn't assume that every 18, 19-year-old has all of their politics figured out. I certainly didn't when I was 18, 19, maybe other people did. And I would love to see campuses primarily address anti-Semitism as well as, again, other Islamophobia and other bigotries that also are present on campus through an educational framework. I mean, the work that Susannah mentioned that she did at Dartmouth, I read about it, and it's really extraordinary to be able to model this is how we talk to each other. And I think Dartmouth has been a model for, at least from the outside, looks like it's been a model for helping students to be able to do that. So I would love for there to be an educational approach, and also, of course, for campuses, every campus has their different speech and conduct codes, and they can apply that in every situation, right? So not only in a situation where the protests are about Israel, but they need to apply it consistently over whatever is happening on campus. What we saw was a lot of campuses moving directly to being punitive and specifically calling in the police, which, by the way, doesn't help Israel or Palestinians or anybody, and really just inflames the situation, and certainly makes it harder to have any kind of educational conversation. So I think that the campuses should, as much as possible, try to take an educational approach. Now, of course, there are times for there to be, Title VI investigations, and Title VI. I think I saw in the question some people saying, "Wait, do you want to get rid of any discrimination laws?" No, of course not. I'm distinguishing between discrimination laws barring discrimination and specific definitions. So Title VI. This was made explicit in the Obama administration through a letter specifically saying that it applies to Jews, Muslims, and Sikhs, but it didn't. That doesn't mean that there has to be a legal definition, because, like I said, everything is contextual. So there is no legal definition of Islamophobia or legal definition of bigotry against Sikhs or anybody else, because Title VI can be applied based on the context. When there's discrimination, there can be investigations that, again, take into consideration the discrimination or the context of the situation. So basically, I think that campuses should be places where free speech is encouraged, where students are helped to understand both that there might be speech that they don't agree with, that they feel that makes them feel uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that it's illegal. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily anti-Semitism. And also, hopefully, there's ways to encourage students who are protesting to also learn about the situation on the ground in the Middle East, but also places where their speech might cross over the line into anti-Semitism. And by the way, I know situations of students even doing this kind of training for each other, even inside of the encampments. We didn't hear that much about it, but those stories exist. And the last thing that I want to say about this is that the people who are on campus are generally, they know their campus, and very often when things get the most difficult is when outsiders, outside organizations, or other outside agitators are riling people up outside of campus, when there's a story that comes out that may or may not be true, when there's a Facebook post that may or may not be true about the campus, and all of a sudden the campus is getting 1,000 phone calls from parents, alumni, people who have absolutely no connection to the campus, outside organizations coming on. That is really, I hear this from rabbis on campus all the time, as well as from students and administrators. That is really unhelpful in terms of promoting a healthy conversation on campus, which can be best be done by the people who are directly on that campus and know the culture, know the people, and are invested in the relationships.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn that question back to Alyza, and then I'm just going to preview the next question I'm going to ask, which I think might take us to the end of our time. I'm seeing a lot of people asking in the chat for us to be a little more clear in the panel about how the definitions differ in terms of how they define, and like when they say anti-Israel criticism crosses the line into anti-Semitism. I know that's a question I brought up earlier. I think if we can drill down into specific examples, actually that might be helpful for some people in the Q&A. But first, Alyza, I know that I feel like you might have something to say about when campuses should restrict free speech. I know that the Brandeis Center has filed some Title VI complaints both before and after October 7th. I guess I want to ask you in a little bit of a more pointed manner also, what are the limits? Like do you ever see other people filing federal anti-Semitism discrimination lawsuits where you're like, you know what, maybe that was a step too far, maybe that speech should have been permitted? So yeah, if you could speak to all of that, that'd be great.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a lot. Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'm all for dialogue and constructive conversation. But the problem that the campuses have right now is that they don't recognize that there are people on those campuses that are not interested in having a dialogue. And this was going on for a while. I mean, I can tell you back in 2018, for example, NYU passed a BDS resolution that wasn't just to boycott companies doing business in Israel, but was to boycott all the pro-Israel groups on campus. We saw a similar resolution a couple of years after that at Tufts. But at NYU, you had 53 student orgs that signed on to that BDS resolution, and we're going to boycott all the Jewish groups on campus. And so the university, to its credit, hired a professional facilitator to facilitate a dialogue among all these groups. And I talked to students who went. And what happened is the facilitator explained, this is not a debate. We're not here to try and convince somebody I'm right, you're wrong. We're just going to share our thoughts and our feelings about these issues. And what happened is a 1.5-hour session was supposed to be a dialogue, turned into a 2.5-hour conversation about whether the anti-Zionist would even dialogue with the Zionists. They said, we showed up here because we don't want to risk losing our student government funding, but you can't force us to talk to each other. And there was one Palestinian student in that room. And as was reported to me, the student said, I don't understand it. The Jewish students seem to want to hear my story, but my allies won't let me tell it. And after 2.5 hours, the facilitator gave up. She sent everyone home, and the university announced, we're not divesting from Israel. That's very nice, but it didn't do a darn thing to address the relationship between the students. And when Susannah talks about the issue of sexual violence, that was also foreshadowed by things going on campus. We represented clients at SUNY New Paltz who had created an organization to help support and empower survivors of sexual assault. And when one of the leaders who created that organization shared, and this is again way before 2023 in October, she shared on her personal Instagram account, it had nothing to do with the club, a Chen Mazig post that said that the Jews are an ethnic group who come from Israel, and you can't colonize a place your ancestors are from. That's quintessentially expressing your Zionism, because you're saying I'm part of a people indigenous to the land of Israel. And what happened is her co-chair said, if that's your feeling about Palestine, you cannot be part of our club. They kicked her out of the organization she started to support sexual assault survivors. They cut her off from the Google Drive and the social media. And then when an Israeli student who'd been very active shared the same post, they did the same to her. Same thing happened at University of Vermont, when after the last Gaza conflict in 2021, there was a sexual assault survivor group. Thousands of students. It was the largest support group on campus. They posted that they were blocking Zionists. And when Jewish students tried to engage, they said, we want to talk. They said, we don't talk to Zionists. So what's happening today on campus is the shunning and the exclusion and the pushing out of these students, not because of any political opinion they may have, but simply because they're defining themselves as part of a people indigenous to the land of Israel. And in fact, last semester at Boston University, SJP put together a booklet called Smash Zionism. And how does Smash Zionism begin? The very first sentence says, we do not accept the term, quote, Jewish people in any form whatsoever. And it goes on, it says, for us, there's only one Jew. Like all Jews know, there's only one God, and that is a religious Jew. So what's happening on campus today, right, is the erasure and denial of identity of Jews. So now let's talk about how we can tell the difference and how you can go to the... I just want to say this. I really want to be respectful. If you look at the IHRA definition, let me just finish this so people can actually follow it and see, because this goes to what the difference is between the definitions. So if you go back to the 2010 definition, you'll see that when it says, it takes the examples relative to Israel and it breaks it up into 3 categories. Some of you will recognize that as what are called Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, because the 3 subheadings are demonize Israel, double standard for Israel, and delegitimize Israel. Demonize Israel is when you would visualize that caricature of the Jew as the evil, bloodthirsty, conniving Jew, but instead of it being applied to individual Jews, it's applied now to Israel as the collective Jew. That's demonized. Yeah. Double standard, fine. Delegitimize. I just have to say, because delegitimize is the key difference. But this is the key difference between the definitions, Ben. So delegitimize Israel is defined as denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. In 2010, they said, and denying Israel the right to exist. And in IHRA definition, it says, by calling Israel a racist endeavor. That's one of the key distinctions between the Jerusalem Declaration and the IHRA definition. But if you think about it, why is denying Israel's right to exist anti-Semitic? Because at heart, what gives the Jews the right to sovereignty in this land is not that we're a religion. It's that we're a people indigenous to that land.
Okay,
so I'm sorry. I'd
like to jump in.
Denying the Jewish people that they're denying that the Jews are a people and that we have a history in the land of Israel. That is one of the key differences between the definitions.
I want to jump in, and I'd like to just say that let's be brief in our answers. We have 15 minutes left, and I'd really love to give everyone a chance to speak. So Susannah, I want to turn to you. You can respond to any of that, but I also want to move off of that question specifically. And what are some positive ways? Somebody asked an interesting question, which is that how does engaging positively with Jewish identity on campus, which is obviously your milieu, but in general in life, how does that contribute to this conversation, and how does that speak to the issues that we've been discussing?
Yeah, so, I've noticed a few things. First of all, when I was a graduate student back in the 1980s, it was the most exciting thing for academics, certainly in the humanities, social sciences, to think about Jews. Sander Gilman made it so exciting to understand Europe or America. Think about Jews. And then you can see something about the unfolding of our intellectual and political histories. We can see the problem that, for example, liberalism couldn't cope with the Jews, nor could communism, nor could nationalism, and so on. It was great. Where is that today? Why have we lost that? I would like to revive that, to understand that, yes, indeed, Jews are complex, as both Jill and Alyza indicated. We don't fit the categories. We're not just a religion. Yes, we are a people, and so on. So the complexity of Jewish identity and Jewish history and politics and so on, that's actually intellectually the most exciting thing we can think about. So that I would like to see revived. Now, I also think that requires a commitment that we need to have to academic work. We started the field of Jewish studies in the 19th century again, this is an important thing for Jews to understand our history. We need to know our history that began in the 19th century. Academic scholarship is extremely important for us to understand even things that we think turn out maybe they didn't happen. but also certain attitudes. And I'll give you a personal example. I was a junior professor, and a colleague of mine who was teaching a class had told the students that Israel had done a preemptive strike in 1967 against Egypt. And I thought that was anti-Semitic, and I told him so. I was very upset, as if Israel started the Six-Day War. Well, actually, there was a preemptive strike, and Israel bombed the airplanes and the runways in the Egyptian Air Force early one morning while the pilots were having breakfast, and that was great. So he was correct, and I perceived it as anti-Semitic at the time, and I realized, okay, I need to think about this in more complex academic terms, but also I had to realize that I was feeling fragile. And my Jewish fragility is exactly what Zionism wants me to overcome, not to feel fragile. So that's also an important element here, that I can say, yeah, okay, Israel did a preemptive strike, and that's not a bad thing, because that bombing of the Egyptian Air Force is really what ultimately won the war. If they hadn't done that, it would have been a disaster. Plus all of the rhetoric coming from Nasser. I mean, I don't want to go back, I'm sorry, to go back into the 67 war, but what I'm saying is that sometimes people worry, Jews that I know worry that we are saying something in a history class about Jewish history or Israel's history that they think is anti-Semitic, and I understand why they feel that way, but it's not. Now, I finally just have to say, I worry that anti-Semitism is a cultural code today, as Volkov has written about. I worry that we don't speak in positive terms. I worry also, and this is just a final point, students know almost instinctively when they hear or read something that it's racist, that it's sexist, that it's transphobic, and so on. They know it. But why is it they don't instinctively know when they read something that's anti-Semitic? Why is that?
Do you think the definitions could help with that? Like, is that?
I actually, I think that what helps students is when they have, first of all, when they've gained the ability to question and to understand through their questioning when something's racist, because they see the dynamics within the idea. And I think we need to include Jews in that. We need to include that in our educational system without question. Not just about what happened in the Holocaust, but about the way in which through 2,000 years we have thought about Jews. And the difficulty will be, we don't want to sound like we're condemning Christianity, but there is a Christian role here. So it's sort of David Nierenberg's book on anti-Judaism. How do we translate that into an educational system without sounding anti-Christian, without scaring people, kids, I mean, but integrating it intellectually? So, and then finally, again, the worst thing for us as Jews is to be disunited. We may have different viewpoints, and our viewpoints may change over time. Mine have. Kids who are 18 may have a very left-wing position, and they think nationalism is terrible and ethnicity, all of that. Well, we need to have a liberal Zionism that we can teach them. We need to have explanations, not just condemnations, not just arguments against them, but again, something positive about Israel, about Judaism, about being a Jew, also about something positive about Palestinians. They're also suffering. People in Lebanon are thrilled that Israel finally got rid of Hezbollah. They're rejoicing too. Let's acknowledge that, and seek allies and alliances and explain Israel isn't something negative. It can be something very positive for this world. Very positive, in fact. If somebody wants to boycott Israel, point out to them, you know, Israel could boycott you too. And that means an end to your iPhone, an end to your laptop, an end to your pharmaceutical generic drugs, and tremendous science, etc. So let's talk back to, let's engage in this kind of conversation and dialogue. Listen to each other, make people feel that they are heard, because, and here I'll just say last thing, if I may, Hasidism, this great religious contribution to the world, has a lot to tell us about how to listen to other people, how to hear people and also lift them up. People can change and they can go from despair to joy. Let's study Hasidic texts and learn how to talk to each other. I hope that can be a contribution, that we as Jews have something so valuable and precious to contribute to our world.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question of Jill and one more question of Alyza. Alyza, I know I asked you like 4 questions before, so I'll try to keep this next one to 1 question. So Jill, you know, you talked a lot about dialogue, and we've spent a lot of time on the campus here. If we broaden the scope and think about for just a moment anti-Semitism across the country, are there ways that you want the government to legislate or take action against it? Do you think that the answer is in dialogue or education more broadly, or are there kind of hard limits that you'd like to see in terms of government action?
Thanks, Ben. So more broadly, I mean, I do think that there needs to be a lot more education. It's something that IHRA has been doing a lot of, doing trainings for often our partners in the human rights and social justice world who are really curious and trying to figure out where this line is. So I don't think that the government should legislate definitions of anti-Semitism, any definitions, even ones that I like, better than the IHRA definition. I also am very concerned about, particularly under this government, about legal attempts to shut down free speech, which we're already seeing. I mean, we've already seen for a long time, we've seen, I think, more than 35 states at this point pass laws that restrict the state from doing business with companies that boycott, in some cases, Israel, in some cases, the settlements, which is really not anti-Semitism, right? That's really saying we're taking a political stance of boycotting only settlements, which is not where most Israeli Jews live. And that has been extended. Actually, states, particularly Texas, have passed laws that also restrict states from doing business with companies that, for example, discriminate, that's the language, discriminate against fossil fuel companies or discriminate against arms manufacturers, right? This is like the BDS legislation has been basically a canary in the coal mine to shutting down other kinds of free speech. Like if a company says, we don't want to, like if a bank, this has really happened, a bank says, we're not going to lend money to companies that don't have, to arms companies that don't have certain restrictions against, for example, selling to minors, etc. So I'm very concerned about the infringement on free speech.
Are there ways that you think the government should be taking action?
Yeah. So,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, so there's, you know, I think that, as I said before, I'm very concerned about the rise of white nationalism, and particularly about the release of the January 6th dependents. And I think certainly common sense gun legislation is extremely important in terms of protecting both Jewish communities and other communities. And that could come from, you know, we've seen most of the violence coming from the right, but also there were shootings at synagogues over the past year. And applying existing law, right? There is existing law against violence, against defacing property, against bomb threats, right? Other kinds of threats that have been made, threats or direct violence against the Jewish community. There is existing law that can speak to that. What I don't think we want is to try to legislate definitions that are already being used to shut down free speech.
Thank you. And Alyza, I'll let you take us home. I know I cut you off a little bit, so if you want to finish talking about where you think anti-Israel speech crosses the line into anti-Semitism, and I want to ask you specifically, what are some examples of anti-Israel protests that you think don't cross the line, and in your ideal legal conception or physical conception, like what are some ways that Israel could be protested that don't cross the line into anti-Semitism? Thank you.
First, I want to say, I very much agree with what Susannah was saying about Jewish unity and the need for Jewish unity and the need for people to understand Jewish identity and the contributions of the Jewish people and Israel to the world. I mean, today and throughout history. And I think that's crucial. I think, the challenge that we have today, and here's where you talk about, I think the definitions need to be used correctly, including the IHRA definition. So if you had, for example, I mean, in our country, as Jill said correctly, you can say some horrible things in this country. You can say racist things, you can say bigoted things, you can say anti-Semitic things, and that speech is protected speech. So if you have folks who were standing and abiding by what we call the time, place, and manner restrictions, right? They were in their designated area and they were just holding signs, that would be one thing. And then they are, maybe very well protected. Okay, some of the private schools don't necessarily have to. They say they follow the First Amendment, but that could be protected, right? Certainly in the public school campuses. But the problem is that that's not where it's ending, right? What we're seeing over and over again is that these groups they're trailing the Jewish students. And again, it's not students who have said that we're debating Israel's policies. It's students who they may have heard speaking Hebrew, who they may have seen wearing a Star of David necklace. So they'll trail them, they'll encircle them, they'll try and intimidate them, they'll brush up against them, or we'll see vandalism, which includes some of this rhetoric. And the problem is that then the schools get confused. They don't understand, if they don't understand that this is anti-Semitic, they'll say, oh, this isn't targeting Jews. This is part of, right, a political debate. And so that's why you need to understand what the difference is between the vilification of Jews and trying to equate the Jews with evil, or trying to pressure Jews to somehow disavow their Jewish history and heritage in order to be accepted on campus. And that's my worry, is that we don't have definitions that are adequately explaining to the campus administrators or beyond, right? We now see outside the campuses, right? We see therapists who are being blacklisted. Why? Because they've said that they would agree to treat Zionist patients. We've seen Zionist patients who've been told that they won't be seen by their doctors. We see this now decolonizing therapy in the mental health industry that says that Zionism is an illness of the frontal lobe and that you need to be cured of this illness, right? These are things that we need definitions, right, that will help folks understand why this is seeking to erase and deny our identity as Jews and somehow equate those Jews who take pride in our Jewish history and heritage and equate us with evil. That's unacceptable. That is anti-Semitism. Everybody needs to be welcome to the table and allowed to fully engage in society today with their full identities. Nobody, and that includes Jews, right? Right now what's happening is Jews are being told, if you view yourself as part of a people indigenous to the land of Israel, that's the one identity that's unacceptable today. And that has to stop, and we need a definition that'll help people see that. That's what I think. And so,
Thank
yes,
you.
I'm all for Jewish unity and Jewish pride. And I do think that the way to get people to understand what Jewish identity is all about is for us to stand up proudly and securely as Jews.
So thank you, and thank you to all of our panelists. There are a lot of questions we didn't get to. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. I hope that this conversation gave some insight and clarity. I think it certainly did, into anti-Semitism and how we fight it and what counts as it. Thank you so much. I want to turn it back over to our hosts. Thank you again for hosting us. Thank you everyone for attending. I would be happy for at least my contact information to be shared if anyone has any questions to be followed up after this. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Shavuot Tov. First of all, give yourself a round of applause for coming today, okay? And everybody out, and for everybody participating in this session with such great decorum. One of the goals of Rabbi Spilker at Mount Zion and everybody that worked on this program was to engage in a difficult discussion in a civil manner, an informed manner, one in which brings the dignity that this event presupposes. So thank you for everybody. It's a way of looking into a better future. Huge thanks to so many different people. First of all, Rabbi Spoker and the entire congregation and everybody from your team that worked so hard on today's event. And there were a lot of pieces to it. But what I always say about Rabbi Spilker is not only the great illustrator of the big picture, but the man knows his details. So thank you, and that's a rare combination in this world. So, thank you very much. To our JCRC team, our board chair, JC Grace, and Dorit Fishman, and Sammy, and Nina, and Ethan, and Patrick are all here today. The fact that we are dedicating so many people to this underscores the importance of this issue and this discussion to our organization. Chow Lee from Representative McCollum's office. Chow is an indomitable figure in this community, and how wonderful it is that you are here today, and a great friend. And of course, Ben Sales. Ben, thank you for being a wonderful moderator, and Lisa Lewin, Susannah Heschel, and Joe Jacobs. Wow, what an outstanding panel. Let's have a discussion. To all of our co-sponsors, and you've heard them before, but thank you. So it bears repeating: the St. Paul Jewish Federation, Hineni, Beth Jacob, Temple of Aaron, Jewish Community Action, ADL of the Midwest. So thank you, everybody, for coming. This is tomorrow, the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance, as recognized by the United Nations. This is also the congregation of blessed memory of Rabbi Gunther Plaut, and I connect the two of these because Rabbi Plaut was born in Berlin, came to the United States in 1935 to attend the Hebrew Union College, received this rabbinical ordination. On the very day that he became a United States citizen, he enlisted in the United States Army as a chaplain. He was there at the first camp that was liberated April 12, 1945, the Nordhausen Dora camp, which is a sub-camp of Buchenwald. So there we have it. Here we are in the congregation where Rabbi Plaut, for so many years, provided intellectual and theological leadership to this community and to this entire country, and eventually Canada. And he was a concentration camp liberator. So let's keep Rabbi Plaut in my mind. But something else about Rabbi Plaut, and I thank Rabbi Neil Borowitz for this, because I read this morning as I was taking a little deeper dive into Rabbi Plaut, that he was a great fusion. He was a Reformed rabbi, but he believed deeply in Orthodox teachings, particularly Hasidic teaching, and something that was very close to Rabbi Plaut's heart was a Hasidic teaching that every Jew must light the Ner Tamid in his or her. In other words, light, right? Light is knowledge. Knowledge is light. And when we sit here today and engage in this important discussion, as Rabbi Spilker said at the very beginning, we try to, in a way, to use a 70s term, expand our consciousness or expand our mind, right? It's hugely important. Okay, well, it's my draw from what you meant. Okay. We think about such things, and to gather as a community, thank you very much. Hundreds of people online, 200 people here, and one more quick thank you to the St. Paul Police and our security who are also here today. But I also want to add one final note, and that's the teaching of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Because knowledge is key, light is key, but also life is key. Because he says the life of the law has not been logic, but experience. So our definitions are hugely important. It's how we apply these definitions, and it's how we apply our own life's experiences to these situations, which helps us use the term, define our lives in the world. And yes, as a JCRC, we definitely believe in positive expression of our philosophy and our theology as Jewish people. So this certainly lives that tradition today. So thank you very much. And I know, Adam, I think you have one more piece to cover today. So thank you very much. And let's just stick around.
We're going to say goodbye to our panelists and everybody online in just a moment, and want to just note that we privilege listening to our panelists, even though there is a lot of benefits sometimes to have conversation amongst us here in the room. So we are going to do that for just 2 minutes after we say goodbye. But I do want to just note that if you leave today knowing that there are different definitions of anti-Semitism, and that if you study them, you can understand some nuances that are really important, that have real life implications, then we have succeeded. And so I invite you to, again, look at those definitions, see where they differ. We heard some of those differences from our panelists. The White House, when they released their report on anti-Semitism, lifted up the IHRA definition and the Nexus definition. They did not mention the Jerusalem definition. We can research that part if you're curious about that a little bit more. But these are the things that I want us as a community to be aware of. So thank you so much to our panelists, to everybody online. Goodbye and appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
For those of us in the room, you can say, turns off our webinar, to just turn to the person next to you and just say one insight that you feel like we learned from today. Just turn to each other for 2 minutes before you get up. One